A soldier is dying every single day from a bullet nobody sees coming. Japanese snipers are hidden high up in the trees, and the American troops walking below have no idea they're even there until it's too late. Into this mess walks a young lieutenant carrying something nobody else in his unit has, a hunting rifle from back home with a scope on it. His own officers had laughed at it, called it a toy, a rich man's deer rifle, not a weapon for war. That lieutenant was John B. George. What he did with that rifle became one of the most talked about stories to come out of the Pacific War. Most of it is true. Here's what actually happened. George grew up in a small town called Princeton, Missouri. Before the war, he was already a serious competitive rifle shooter with a real reputation for it in long-range shooting circles. He joined the Army in 1941 and shipped out to the Pacific with the 132nd Infantry Regiment, landing on Guadalcanal in late 1942 to relieve Marine forces who'd been fighting there since August. He never trusted the way the Army taught men to shoot. In the book he wrote a few years later, he said plainly that most American infantry weren't trained to shoot well at all. He even said a skilled archer could probably outshoot the average rifleman carrying the Army's own M1 Garand. That belief is exactly why he brought his own hunting rifle to war. He was convinced that in jungle fighting, real shooting skill mattered more than the Army realized. That rifle was a Winchester Model 70. A civilian hunting rifle chambered for the same round as the standard-issue Garand. The difference was in how you fired it. The Garand was semi-automatic. Pull the trigger, it fires, and the next round's already chambered. George's Winchester was bolt action. Every single shot meant working the bolt by hand before he could fire again. What he had going for him instead was the scope, a Lyman Alaskan. A small, fixed 2.5 power sight, nothing special by today's standards, but a real advantage over the plain iron sights most infantrymen were stuck squinting through. He'd tried to have the rifle shipped to him in time for deployment, but the paperwork moved slower than his unit did. He ended up sailing for the Pacific without it, frustrated at not having his good scope-sighted rifle with him, carrying nothing but a small stash of hunting ammunition he'd packed at the last minute. By his own telling, the rifle finally caught up with him after the fighting on Guadalcanal had already started. Did his fellow officers actually mock it as a mail-order sweetheart, the way some retellings put it? Nobody's ever produced proof anyone said those exact words. That line seems to come from recent videos, not from George himself. But the underlying tension was real. In 1942, the Army had no real plan for personal scoped rifles, and a lieutenant showing up with a deer rifle would have gotten plenty of looks from the men around him. The setting of this story checks out completely, and not just from George's own telling. His regiment took over ground the Marines had bled for, including brutal fighting for high ground like Mount Austin, then pushed toward the Matanikaw River and an area called Point Cruz in January 1943. Japanese soldiers retreating from the airfield dug into thick coastal jungle, and Japanese marksmen, some of them using scoped rifles, made that jungle deadly for American patrols moving through it. That's the world George was fighting in, and it's exactly where his personal rifle gave him something most soldiers around him didn't have: a scope for spotting hidden targets at distance and years of serious shooting behind him instead of basic Army training. Picture what that fighting actually looked like. Point Cruz wasn't open ground. It was coconut groves and dense coastal jungle, the kind of terrain where you could stand 10 feet from another man and never see him. The Japanese soldiers dug in there weren't running. They'd been pushed off Henderson Field and were making their retreat as costly as possible, and their marksmen knew how to use that jungle better than anyone. A man could climb into cover before dawn, go still and simply wait, sometimes for hours, for one American to wander into view. That's the kind of fight George walked into. Not a firefight in the open, but a game of patience and eyesight, decided by whoever spotted the other man first. That's exactly where George's rifle earned its keep. A Garand-armed infantryman scanning that jungle with iron sights was looking at a wall of green and shadow. George, looking through even a modest 2.5 power scope, could pick apart that wall, separate a man's outline from a tangle of vines, catch the wrong shape in a tree fork, notice a shadow that didn't belong. His years of competitive shooting meant that once he found a target, he wasn't guessing at the shot. He'd spent a decade learning to read wind, judge distance, and put a bullet exactly where he meant to the first time, which mattered enormously with a bolt-action rifle that gave him no second chance if he missed and gave away his position. His own book describes this kind of engagement as slow, deliberate work, long stretches of watching and waiting broken by short, decisive moments, not a running gunfight. Now here's where you have to be careful, because this is where the real story and the internet version start pulling apart. A bunch of recent YouTube videos about George go far beyond anything in his actual book. Exact times down to the minute, exact yardages, made-up conversations between George and his commanding officer, elaborate decoy sniper tricks where Japanese snipers supposedly baited him with a visible target while a second man waited to kill whoever took the shot. A very specific body count of 11 snipers killed in 4 days. None of that shows up in George's own writing. Maybe some of it happened, and he just never wrote it down that precisely. Memories can be sharp, and it's not impossible a soldier remembered details vividly, but nobody's pointed to where in the actual book any of this comes from. And the second-by-second sniper duel, with its decoys and exact numbers, reads exactly like drama bolted on afterward to make a video punchier. What holds up, straight from George's own account, is simpler, but still genuinely impressive. He really did use his personal scoped rifle in the fighting around Point Cruz in January 1943, engaging Japanese soldiers and marksmen in exactly that kind of close, patient jungle combat, and it became a central part of the story he told about that campaign. His book remains one of the most detailed first-hand records of small arms combat left behind by any American soldier on Guadalcanal. That book came out in 1947, called Shots Fired in Anger. Later editions expanded it to cover Burma, too. He wrote it as a plain, technical account, what weapons and tactics actually worked in combat, not a story about making himself look heroic. Gun collectors and military historians still recommend it today for being unusually honest and detailed, and it's still in print more than 75 years later. It's also surprisingly hard on the Army itself. George argued American soldiers went into combat badly undertrained in basic shooting, and that the Army cared more about spit and polish discipline than actually teaching men to hit what they aimed at. That kind of honest self-criticism, instead of the usual hero story, is a big part of why the book has held up as real history instead of wartime propaganda. After the fighting on Guadalcanal ended in early February 1943, George's war moved somewhere very different. He joined the 5307 Composite Unit, better known by its nickname, Merrill's Marauders. The unit marched deep behind Japanese lines in northern Burma, with no regular supply chain, eventually helping capture the Mite Kiana airfield in 1944, a brutal campaign where disease killed far more men than combat did. George reportedly carried a rifle with him into Burma as well. Some retellings say he swapped parts to make it lighter, a smaller scope, a different stock, which would make sense given how much weight mattered on a march like that. But there's no solid proof of it beyond the dramatized videos, so treat it as a reasonable guess, not a confirmed fact. What happened after the war is much easier to nail down because it's ordinary biographical record, not combat memory. George left the Army in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, then went to Princeton on the GI Bill, studied politics, and graduated with highest honors. From there, he spent about 4 years at Oxford, then roughly 4 more in East Africa studying the region. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., where he ran an organization called the Institute of African American Relations, and later worked as a consultant and writer on African affairs for the State Department. He also wrote hunting and outdoor pieces, including work published in the Saturday Evening Post, a fitting second act for a man once known for his shooting. He almost never talked about the war afterward. Plenty of his colleagues in Washington knew he'd served in the Pacific and Burma, but had no real idea what he'd actually done there. The story of his rifle and the fighting at Point Cruz stayed mostly inside the pages of his own book. And that's really the heart of it. Even without the exaggeration, the invented dialogue, the stopwatch timestamps, the made-up spotter named Corporal Hayes, the tidy 11 in 4 days body count, this is still a great story on its own. A skilled marksman who didn't trust the Army's training, who brought his own gear into one of the most dangerous jungle fights of the Pacific War despite getting mocked for it, who used it well enough to make a real difference, who went on to fight with one of the toughest special units of the war, and who quietly built a completely different life afterward in writing and diplomacy. All while leaving behind a memoir that historians still turn to today because it's honest instead of heroic.